Okay, so all this will sound very familiar. Some disclaimers to remind you that this is not a private conversation and is being recorded and will ultimately be made available to the public. If at any point we get into a line of questioning that you don't want to discuss, just let me know and we'll redirect to something else. If you need a break, just let me know that as well. And I'm going to do my best to let you tell your story without interrupting and talking too much on my part. So today is Friday, June the 8th, 2018. My name is Andy Reisinger, and I'm interviewing Alvin Burrell here in the Department of Special Collections and Archives at Georgia State University as part of the Great Speckled Bird Oral History Project. And this is actually our second session, a follow-up interview to complete your history. And once again, if I can get your verbal consent to be recorded.
Yeah, I consent to the recording.
So last time we talked, we covered a lot of ground, your childhood, up through your college years, and your move to Atlanta, and getting involved with the Great Speckled Bird, and that's in 1974, yes?
Yes.
And I think we mentioned a little bit like your motivations for coming to Atlanta were specifically to work on the bird.
That's right.
And
a long time ago.
Yeah, and that you and a girlfriend had moved, and
Kathy Ellison,
and had settled in a small basement apartment.
Correct.
And you were working as circulation manager.
Right. And she was advertising manager. We were the dirty work of the operation, I guess.
Yeah, yeah. And were those paid positions at the time?
Initially, yes.
Okay.
I think we got paid 2 or 3 times. I think by either December of 74 or January of 75, Doyle allotted the last cash proceeds. A lot of it came from the bird boxes as our, whatever it was, $60 salaries. And he just said, this is it. You'll need to have at least some sort of part-time work if you want to have income.
Mm. And so what did you guys do for part-time or
She
paid
worked,
work?
I did well, initially it was in January, so I actually started what I would later, many years ago, I returned to, which was I did accounting. I did tax returns that winter was the first thing I did.
And remind me what you ultimately had majored in college?
Well, initially at University of Tennessee, I majored in sociology, psychology.
That's right.
And then I went back in 86 and graduated with an accounting degree in 89.
Here from Georgia State?
Yes, right here at Georgia State.
Yeah.
Very much. So anyway, that's what it was like then. And after that, even though we had a lot of people were working something very close to full time, nobody was compensated. Mm-hmm. Kathy briefly hired an advertising salesperson. Just kind of a hustler type. I saw him at a pool hall once, but he did get out and sell some ads for us, and we did give him a small commission for his work. We were trying desperately to bring in as much income as we could. It seemed like the newly started Atlanta Gazette and the Creative Loafing, which had been around for a while, we're drawing in just a whole lot more advertising revenue, and the clubs, the restaurants, the little stores, and of course all the entertainment venues found they could reach the public better through those 2 publications. So it was really hard for us to keep some advertising. A lot of the people that had been around for a long time, like the Fox and Great Southeast Music Hall and some of the natural foods restaurants, still advertised with us, but it was smaller ads.
Mm-hmm. And by this point, you had gone to a distribution method of having the newspaper boxes
Correct.
around town.
We still, like, there was a bookstore downtown, what was it called, the Hudson? Downtown that it still sold some birds. There were a few other places that kept them on the counter. But yes, for the most part, I forget how many bird boxes we had.
Yeah, but moving away from the street sellers.
Yes, there were a couple guys. Some of the guys would just, there were still a few left, like the Notorious Wolf, and he would go in and just put in a quarter and take out all the papers and sell them on the street. But people advised me, no, it's good. He actually is good for the paper. People are much more inclined to buy from him sometimes if they're driving down Peachtree than they are to stop and get out and put a quarter in a box.
And can you describe a bit of the Notorious Wolf?
Well, he was just a long-haired, very white-haired, blonde hippie. He part of his income came from making porn movies. So, he was around for a long time. He actually helped us a little bit when we had the 84, 85 revival. He sold papers for us again. Several of the bird folk knew him better than I. I mean, I just exchanged greetings with him, and like I said, his for me as circulation manager, his role was somewhat outlaw, but at the same time, I realized he really wasn't hurting us because at that point we just wanted to keep our circulation up as much as we could. The most of the revenue we had did come from advertising more than circulation.
And was he homeless at the time?
I don't think he was homeless. I think he had a some little apartment. I don't think he was homeless.
Okay.
Like I said, he had been quite. I understand he'd been at some point quite a popular porn star. So he may have had a little bit of trust fund. Who knows? He just liked the street lifestyle as near as I could tell.
Okay. And it was widely known that he starred in pornographic movies.
Amongst the bird people, I don't know.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah, because you mentioned.
I mean, you've heard other people mention him, I assume, haven't you? Or is this the first time?
I think this is the first time that anybody on tape. However, I lived in the Ponce Highlands neighborhood.
Yeah.
Probably.
I thought he had an apartment.
2000 to
North
2010.
Avenue. Yeah. I thought he had an apartment somewhere around North Avenue or Ponce.
Yeah, but he was a fixture of the neighborhood.
Yes.
Even these many decades or several decades later. Yeah. And I wasn't sure whether he was homeless or not. He was always on the street.
Correct.
Just walking around and, on a bench or... But he was a fixture of the community and sort of a notorious figure.
He was kind of, in a lot of ways, he harkened back to the heyday of the late '60s with the whole Midtown strip scene, which had completely vanished by the '80s.
Yeah, but I wasn't aware of this backstory. Like, I knew of him from my time living there, but he was just a...
When I came in, he was not the only one. In 74, 75, 76, he was not the only street vendor. In 80, I think pretty much he was the only one in the 84, 85 revival. There weren't too many. But there were probably, at least a half a dozen guys around. He was just the most notorious, most well-known.
And I don't think we explicitly... We talked about your fascination with the paper and coming to Atlanta to work on it. I don't think we spoke specifically about sort of your personal ideals and passions passions, ideas about the world during that period of time that influenced your getting involved with this whole scene, with the paper? Could you speak to that a little bit?
Well, it's just, I was very much a part of the student movement. I was more political than cultural. I never really felt extremely comfortable with the term hippie, though I didn't run from it either. So it was, I wanted change very, very deeply. I felt that there were the problems that we saw in war and racism and poverty had roots in our economic system, in our political system, and I felt they desperately needed to be changed. I guess I was hopeful there could be some sort of minimally violent revolution that we could somehow rechange and establish some sort of more socialistic democracy. That was what I was looking for then. I had done a little studying of Marx and Engels and the revolutionary teachings of Lenin and Trotsky, but I didn't really ever become, outside of a very short time that I worked with YSA, which was part of the Socialist Workers' Party. I never really got involved in any organized political group, but I usually tried to plug into movements or causes, anti-war movement, fair housing, hunger campaigns, those types of things where I would focus on. So I saw, anyway, so The Bird was the largest and most, I thought, the best written and most articulate publication in the South that articulated all these causes, and it was just amazing. It was one of the first places I think I saw where gay rights were treated as a legitimate cause, and I began to understand some of the stories that were written. I began to understand some of the issues involved with the gays and lesbians. The other letters transgender and bi really hadn't been articulated yet. But anyway, but those articles were in there, and women's rights was very well spoken out there. And I loved following the Atlanta politics that was in the paper. Like I told you, I was originally from Atlanta. My father grew up here. My grandfather had lived here a large part of his adult life, and even my great-grandfather had worked here a little. So I felt a real connection to Atlanta, and I was just really excited about the changes that were coming to Atlanta with the ascendancy of Maynard Jackson. So I guess that's where, but anyway, so I wanted to be a part of that. I wanted to come back to my hometown and hopefully, be a part of this voice, this newspaper that was articulating, a way to change society both on a local level, because it looked to me like I really, as the war wound down and I saw the student movement dissipate and saw that it was how hard it was for us to organize any kind of true revolutionary groups, that it really was going to get back to changing things on the local level. And it looked like Atlanta was a good place to be if you were going to stay in the South. So anyway, I just was glad to be able to live out my ideals by coming here and working for the Bird.
And how did your parents respond to your decision to come to Atlanta and be involved in this type of work and activism?
I guess they were generally just tolerant. I mean, I think they both felt I should have pursued a professional career they would have preferred that, but they were both liberals, and they were generally tolerant. I think that they were so horrified by what had happened, over the racial conflict and all the conflict that came around the war in Vietnam. I think they were fairly disillusioned. They didn't really fault me. So they were generally tolerant. They didn't really want to encourage me too much either, but they didn't condemn me. And my relationship with them was always good. We had a lot of good discussions. Now, with the more extended family, aunts, uncles, cousins, so many of my cousins especially, well, actually both the southern cousins as well as the northern cousins, they were from more of a working class background. Many of my peers, the young men my age, were in the Army, and many of them went to Vietnam. Or several of them, not many people, but several. And my female cousins married men that were involved in Vietnam. And so there was a little bit of tension. As I said in the earlier segment, I was not involved in condemning soldiers or the men that participated in the war. I felt in some ways they were victims of, I don't think they appreciated being people like me in the counterculture, the leftist culture, describing them that way. But I did feel like they were somewhat exploited. But at the same time, I was firm in my belief that the war was wrong, and that we needed to stop it as quickly as possible.
And with your extended family, how would the disagreement?
It rarely came up.
Yeah.
I did not pursue it. I would not have dinner at my uncle's house and have a discussion with my cousin whose husband was currently either in Vietnam or maybe stationed somewhere else in Germany or on the West Coast. I wasn't going to go in there and talk about how it was terrible to kill Vietnamese. I just didn't have the stomach for that, and I didn't see where it would be productive. I think they understood, they could tell by looking at me that I was definitely a part of the counterculture.
And on the point of...
So, yeah, it was sort of a dual life. Yeah, I had, but I didn't spend that much time with family, just a few times a year that I would see other people other than my parents. And then, of course, I'd be back in my own community where we were very much enmeshed in talking daily about the war and other social justice issues and all the many issues that could have been discussed on the burn.
Mm-hmm. And on the subject of a lot of your extended family, the men in your extended family and peers of yours serving in the military, being drafted, how did the draft play out for you?
For me, I mean, I really didn't want to go to college. When I became of draft age, they had the student deferment was in full effect. As long as you maintained a year's progress through your undergraduate degree, you were allowed to avoid military service. So I pursued that course at the urging of my father, who wasn't that big on the Vietnam War. And then when I was 20, they had the lottery was held in the fall of 1969. And I got a high draft number, a high lottery number. So at that point, I personally didn't have to worry about being drafted and having to deal with that, how I would deal with that. But I actually became a little bit more freed up to spend more time on activism because I didn't have to, and I took 5.5 years to get my bachelor's degree at that point because I didn't have to maintain completing a year of a year of work
Mm-hmm.
in school. So I actually went down to minimum hours and spent a whole lot more time being an activist for the last 2 years I was in college, or actually 3 years.
Yeah.
So that's the way it impacted me.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you know, the luck of the draw. You know, I felt really, I didn't, it was, I felt, you know, just because of my own, you know, idealistic moral bearings, I felt like it was my duty to fight the war all the harder, that I knew was unjust. Like I said, in the way that I did. I was able to devote more time because my own personal freedom, as it was not in jeopardy anymore.
Right. And so as circulation manager, can you talk a bit of the day-to-day operations functioning, what that entailed? What
Well, a
was
lot of it was I had to become an expert in repairing and, you know, and cobbling together, trying to keep the old bird boxes going. We had a few spares, and we were able to pull off spare parts when we had, or, you know, a lot of times, you know, all you had to do was buy a bolt or try to repair a piece of metal. The biggest problem was if the plastic cover was broken, which rarely happened. So that was it. You know, and if we usually, because we went out every week, if somebody found a bird box was broken or not operating properly, the person that did that route would let me know, and I would try to go out and fix it. We still did a lot of mailings back then, and I helped keep the list current. But actually, Krista would stop everything once the papers came in, and she knew how to work this very antiquated address machine. And she would just run those through, and then they would be mailed out. I guess we mailed them out of the post office. I forget, you know, I don't remember exactly what that process was.
And did you have big mail bags?
It seems like we had that, or those little bins. We would put them in bins.
And like organized by zip code or something
Whatever
for
the
bulk
post
mailing.
office required, yes,
Yeah.
for bulk mailing. I mean, that's the way I had received the paper for several years when I was in Knoxville.
And do you recall about how wide the distribution was?
Well, at that point, I think it had fallen well below the 20-something thousand we had at our peak, but I think we were still over 5,000 that last year, certainly through 75. But it was, you know, it had fallen quite a bit from its peak. And, you know, part of the uncomfortableness of it, and it was discussed in the meetings, was we would print papers and give them away just to get we wanted our ideas out there. I mean, I think there was still some very good writing being done. There was great graphic works and photographs still being put in the paper. You know, Tom Coffin, Bill Fibbin we're still doing some great pictures. David Jenkins, Bob Dorland, and Stephanie Coffin were still doing great layout work. Anyway, we felt our paper was still worthwhile, and you know, and a lot of people felt that we just couldn't. The masses of kids out there were young adults were no longer quite as enraptured with our political stories and biases. They were more just into the culture at the time, which was, you know, especially the music culture and also the movies and to some extent theater and other visual arts were still doing very well. It was still a very exciting time. And for them, the Gazette and I guess the Creative Loafing was a little more palpable than being hit on the head with you know, people not being able to afford their housing in Atlanta, or the injustices of the sanitation workers. that we were still covering on a regular basis.
Were you still covering the cultural scene though?
Oh yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. We had some very good writers. I'm afraid I'll leave someone off, but I mean we had Julia Kay, Dolores French, Ward Silver. I think his name, Cynthia Cameron's older brother. He did some good reviews for us. There was a lot of Burl Boykin, of course, who did some great movie reviews and play reviews. And of course, Steve Seberg, you know, our little small town Picasso. he was our cultural editor for much of that period. One interesting part, toward the end, I guess it was in '75, Mike Malloy, the left-wing talk radio host that some people may be familiar with, he came to us, I think through Steve Seberg, perhaps through Ward, and he wanted to do a continuing series in the paper called The Last Rock Festival. And we published, I guess, maybe 10 issues of this rock festival, or installments, and it seemed to be just going. Some people became complaining that there was no good political drama to it. It was just, you know, kind of an observation of Southern rock culture at that time, which anyway, they actually stopped it. But to me, it was very interesting because Mike Malloy, along with some other people that he knew, organized a benefit concert for us at Chastain Park, and we got, you know, several $1,000s out of that, and it kept us going for a couple more months, probably in the summer of '75.
But ultimately, folks on the Bird
squashed his effort, and I always wanted to call him up on one of his, back in the 80s and 90s when he was at the height of his talk radio days, and ask him if he had any, if he'd ever completed the novel, and could I see it? But yeah, that was one of the, you know, we generally, like people told you, we were pretty accepting, but there were times when that stuff that he did was like that, where it was I guess it's put away as this maybe just too indulgent for our tastes. So, and yeah. But anyway, yeah, there still was a lot of cultural coverage. It's just we weren't getting the commensurate advertising to go with our efforts on that area.
Yeah.
For me, one of the most memorable episodes I had at the Bird was we were informed that Margaret Mead was in town, the famous anthropologist. She was staying at I believe it's affiliated with the Episcopal Church, Emmaus House, which is just, I guess, a few blocks south of here on Capitol Avenue. And there was nobody around really to interview. It was on a warm summer day. And I went along with J.D. Cade, and we spent 2 hours talking with this world-renowned anthropologist, just interviewing her. She had just completed her her memoir, Blackberry Winter. And it was just, I was, you know, as a person who had studied sociology, I knew a little bit about anthropology, and it was fascinating to sit and talk with this person. And if it hadn't been for the Bird, I never would have gotten to do that.
Yeah. What do you recall coming out of that interview?
Actually, I don't remember anything but just being totally in awe of her. I think we filled up an entire page of the Bird just of her transcript, you know, in our questions for her, you know. we talked, even though she had just pushed, neither of us had had time to read the book yet, but we did go about, over her book and her life and some of her assertions. She was a leading early feminist, an early articulate of feminism, and the fact that women can do scientific work, women can go to foreign countries and deal with people and do they can take care of themselves in these type of situations. So that was a part of her discussion as well. It's just the study, her some discussion of her studies of what Polynesian cultures.
Mm-hmm. And back on the question of circulation, do you recall, like, geographically how wide the distribution of the paper?
Well, we had somewhat contracted, but we covered pretty much everything inside of the perimeter. I mean, we had a downtown route. We did the West End. We had distribution in the West End. We went into several. We had boxes in maybe a store or two in Buckhead. We went into Decatur. As far as the Williamsburg Shopping Center, which is there at Claremont and Briarcliff. We had distribution at Georgia Perimeter College. Of course, we had distribution at Georgia Tech and Georgia State. I think we would maybe, we sent a little bundle to Clayton College at that time, maybe a little bundle to Mercer. And I think we sent a bundle to the University of Georgia. They were mailed.
Yeah.
Bulk mailed, maybe 10 to the Head Shop or Natural Foods Co-op in Athens.
And did you still have many subscribers out of state?
Yeah. Oh yeah. Well, they're mostly in state, but yes, there were out of state, and there were still people, overseas in Europe. I remember there was a few. There was a handful of those still around. But yeah, and around the country, a lot of the other underground newspapers, we exchanged papers with them. I think that at the conference somebody mentioned the Liberation News Service. I remember we would get their packets in the mail, and I'm sure we would send them a copy or a couple copies of the Bird that they could look through it and see if there was anything that we had published that they wanted to pick up on. I remember even Pacifica, I think, would get Pacifica News Service, which is a radio service. They would get a copy of our paper.
And were they still doing free issues to prisoners?
Seems like that was going on. We had, I know that we would publish letters from prisoners. So I think if a prisoner requested, they could get a free issue. Also, I think a person in the military could get a free issue if they requested.
Right.
So we had that. It was funny, I would come in, I think just this past weekend, I think it was Gene Guerrero mentioned that, people got thrown in jail for trying to sell the paper in their small towns in Georgia and maybe some of the adjoining states. And I do remember there was just a huge stack of letters in the circulation manager's desk when I sat there with all these guys, mostly boys, but there was an occasional woman too that had some experience with trying to sell or obtain the Bird in their small town or on their campus. It was my very first week on the job. I got a call from the I think it was some academic, some faculty member at the was it Cascade Road, Georgia's Perimeter College campus, that the security had impounded our bird box on the campus. And he just wanted me to know. So I just said, what do I do? And I guess it was either John Jacobs or Doyle said, you call up Gene, call up the ACLU. So at that point, you know, Gene Guerrero had been the executive director of the Georgia ACLU for some time, and I just remember I introduced myself to Gene, and he was just very, very businesslike. So what has happened? Who did you talk with? And I had the presence of mind to get down names and addresses and phone numbers, and I just reported. And I remember Gene just going, "Okay, I think I know just how to handle this." He said, "I think you'll have the bird box will be back in place by the next distribution next week." And it was. I don't know what Gene did, but evidently you can't impound the press in America. So he evidently explained how the Constitution worked to the security department at Georgia at Perimeter College, and was taken care of. I reminded Gene of that, and he didn't remember it, of course, but he smiled because he said, because evidently he had to do that more times than he could count.
Yeah. Do you recall any other similar instances or pushback that you were getting?
Not really. I mean, every once in a while, somebody would ask us to move they didn't like having our newspapers in front of their store. They were on the sidewalks, so we would move it somewhere. It was very interesting. I don't know if anybody else mentioned this to you, but we had a bird box in front of the Atlanta Playboy Club, and it was always sold out. There was never any papers left in that box.
And where was the Playboy Club?
Oh golly, I don't know. It was downtown, maybe off Cone Street or something. It was in a little bit of it wasn't really a bad area, but I remember it was just dark, and there were tall buildings all around. And it was always a little tricky. I did the downtown route. That was what the circulation manager was supposed to handle. That was the toughest one because, they're parking. Because, back then, downtown was about the only place you had to pay to park. And you could get ticketed or even towed if you weren't careful about where you pulled over. So Steve Seberg, he was very helpful in showing me how to park in downtown area.
Mm.
And it seemed like that was also where we had some of the most, I always had a screwdriver and a pair of pliers and a small rubber hammer with me to do on-the-spot repairs when I could on those boxes downtown.
And do you think that the majority of these repairs were necessitated because of basic wear and tear, or?
Yeah, I think people were just rougher. People, Atlanta doesn't have a real active nightlife, but there were a few bars downtown. There was the Playboy Club. I just thought people were drunk, and saw this old mailbox and kicked it. And there probably were some conservative people that had some particular animosity towards us. During the period I was there, I did not see any systematic vandalism, say, that might have been organized by the city hall or the police department. I never saw any evidence of that during that period that I was there. By the time Maynard Jackson was in, we were on a pretty good basis with the authorities, I felt. I know we antagonized them from time to time, especially Microloan Max, the cultural, I guess he was the cultural arts commissioner or whatever. But we still supported him too. We just were pushing him to do even more in the way of community efforts. But anyway.
What all did you? In what way did you push him? What were you hoping?
Well,
that the city
I guess
would
we
do?
were just trying to get more funding to the neighborhoods or children's groups, or to allow people that were, say, trying to improve their city park on the west end. I'm just kind of speculating. I know Steve Seberg, who was our cultural editor, he knew Microloan Max personally, and I think they even lived not too far from each other. He was always, pushing Microloan Max to do more. And I don't think Michael appreciated it too much. I think he felt he was already out there pretty far.
Mm-hmm.
But that's our job. We're the gadfly, we're the goad.
Right. Talking about, you mentioned Mike Malloy and sort of just the general move in that period towards people being more enamored by issues of culture than the politics. And in the previous interview, you had mentioned, or I made a note of, lines of difference among the staff and in the collective that had to be worked out or put aside at times.
Yes.
Can you elaborate on that a bit?
I'll try. For me, who I felt like I had a firm belief in social justice and using government to hopefully fund and help people have better lives as opposed to the conservative position the government interferes with people having good lives and we need to stay out of it. But I guess, I didn't get involved. There was one of the few issues that I think the left was a little bit slow in coming around to was, say, like population. And it turned out that some of the environmental groups' concerns about population some of the drastic scenarios of overpopulation. Population Bomb was a popular book at the time. Did not pan out because we did avoid famine and mass disease, I guess, through what some people call the Green Revolution. But so I had to keep. I felt at times I needed to kind of tamp down some of my more extreme environmental views, which I had at the time. Also, there was some people thought, even as today, say that vegetarianism was unnecessary or kind of silly. So those kind of things were present. There was some, there were some discussions. There were some people around the bird that had kind of Stalinistic or Maoistic politics that were extremely intolerant of some of the more liberal ideas, and those people, I think, kind of stepped back and didn't really push their articles. I mean, I think there was some very well-written articles about struggles that were taking place in Latin America, Africa, North Africa, Central Asia. But some of those, the kind of articles like you've heard people talk about the October League or the PLO. Those articles were not, those kind of politics were not generally expressed in the Bird, were not covered in that way. So I guess that if that's what you're getting at, one of the big things that I remember people announcing, I guess it was in the fall of '75, fall of '75, that rumors were coming around that Jimmy Carter was planning to run for president, and which he did in '76. As the Bird was, had moved to monthly, and I remember that we made even though we were all fascinated by the idea, and I think kind of hopeful for him, we did not get. I don't remember us getting involved in supporting him. because it would have been it would definitely have been out of our general perspective to get involved with supporting anybody in one of the main American parties.
Mm-hmm.
Does that
Yeah,
address
no,
your question?
that provides
Well, like
a nice context.
sometimes at the meetings, at the staff meetings, people would get a little bit emotional or overwrought or want to come up with some more hard-hitting article. But generally, it worked out, and I don't remember any long-term schisms or fallouts over these political issues. But we would have very long discussions.
So that was still going on.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if other people have talked about it, but the Weather Underground was still around during the period that I was at the Bird. I think Patty Hearst, that whole episode with her and what was the name of that? Her organization, Symbionese Liberation Army. Mm-hmm. SLA, which I never thought they had any kind of coherent ideology. I always wondered if that what they were. But anyway, and I remember pulling her wanted poster off the wall in the 30307 mailbox, post office. But all that was going on, and we didn't really give them a whole lot of coverage. I think we were much more concerned with some of the more standardized issues that were being promoted by papers like The Guardian, the more well-articulated, well-organized liberation groups in Africa, mm-hmm. in the Middle East. PLO got a lot of favorable coverage from us at that time.
And
of course, Cuba
their PLO, you're meaning Palestinian Liberation. And previously you said PLO, which would be Progressive Labor.
Yeah, PLP, Progressive Labor Party.
Okay.
Which was, for lack of a better term, a Maoist mm-hmm. leaning revolutionary socialist group. Mm-hmm. So. I spoke with Stephanie about the use of the term collective when I was there at just this past weekend, and mm-hmm. she just smiled and said, "We were always a cooperative back in the early days. It was later when you and Teresa and some of the others came in that you created a collective where you had voting members and non-voting members." And I said, "Oh, okay." I said, "I wondered because Andy had sort of found what I said a little bit different from what he had heard from most of the earlier members of the staff." So anyway, yeah, that's true. And and like I told you, she was around. She came to a lot of the meetings. A lot of times it seems like Bob would come by too, Bob Goodman. I might be wrong. And they would generally just listen in. They wouldn't get real involved. Anyway, but yeah, we did sort of feel like we wanted to make sure, even though we wanted to use as much as we could consensus basis, we had to limit the number of people that would be involved.
And were you there when the decision to create this collective structure?
No,
this was already in place.
And like I think I said, I came in. They let me be a circulation manager, but it was a little bit later that I actually got to be a voting member of the collective. A month or two later, that I established myself. And I remember my predecessor. His name was Michael Cooper, who later went on to study psychology at Georgia Tech. He had had enough of it. He had just, I guess a lot of people, the meetings were going on too long, and he was actually in a lot of ways less political than I. And he just wanted to get out of it and get back into academia, which he evidently was very successful at ultimately. I actually ran into him several years later. This is jumping a little bit ahead, but when I had just started working at the Magnolia Cooperative Warehouse, I was being trained as a truck driver. And I drove this like 3 or 4 state, 3-day route through Alabama, Tennessee, North Carolina. I actually went into Virginia and back down. And I ran into him at a Waffle House up right up there at the South Carolina border, and he was working on his PhD, his doctoral thesis, and he was studying the psychology of nuclear power plant operators. That was and I thought that was hilarious because at that time I was also very much involved with Georgians Against Nuclear Energy, and anyway, it was fun to. I've never heard from him since or run into him again, but that was just an interesting meeting of someone that we were still looking into the same areas, it appears, but from very different perspectives.
And with the collective, do you recall about how many members, voting members, were in the collective?
10, 12.
Mm-hmm. And these long discussion meetings, I guess meetings of the collective,
yeah.
Were those to determine what was going to be published in any given week? Is that sort of?
Yeah, I mean, generally there wasn't a whole lot of choice. I mean, generally we were working to fill up the paper, but we did have discussions about what would be the feature article or features articles, and there was a lot of people like again, you've heard me mention Julia Kay, Ward Silver, who were bringing in articles weekly, sometimes more than one. Sharon Evans, who did some of the early lesbian coverage. They were not members of the collective. They were very active in they were very much part of us and our identity. They would show up for layout. David Jenkins, Bob Dorland, Dolores French. They would come in to help with layout and do graphics for us, but they weren't voting members.
But they would come to.
And they would submit copy. Yeah. Steve Seberg, he was a culture editor. He was a member of the collective, and he was many times at odds with some of the others. I mean, it may just be my own from my own perspective. All of them. Even though I always I'd considered myself a strong supporter of feminism and women's rights since I heard. Talk shows in the late 60s, it was still tough at times when you would just sort of be doing your thing and all of a sudden have some woman say, that's extremely chauvinist, Alvin. I said, oh really? I didn't think so. What are you talking about? And then and then just to be educated at that point. Seems like there was a term used, criticism, self-criticism, and sometimes we would have to go through that in these collective staff meetings. We would, sexism was always a very frequent topic, as was classism and racism. We still would correct ourselves. If we felt that somebody had, inadvertently slipped into a racist or a sexist or a classist perspective, and whenever, my attitude was, and I think actually most people tried not to be too defensive, because that's what the self-criticism part of it was, is you were supposed to accept it and work with it. I think we considered ourselves a work in progress.
Yeah.
I didn't consider it, some people just felt it was real negative, or not so much people within the collective, but other people when I would tell them about this, and I don't know why you put up with that, but for me, I was growing.
Mm-hmm.
And I tried to, accept it with an open mind and open heart. But sometimes it did hurt, or sometimes you did get caught off guard, especially, the white males.
Mm-hmm. And at the collective meeting, so other people that weren't voting members
Would be present.
would be there and participate
They
in the
could
conversation.
participate. They could usually, a lot of times they didn't get real involved, but sometimes they would be in to talk. Like say Mike Malloy.
Mhm.
He would come in, he might need to come in and defend his article. I think it took us a few meetings before we finally ended his installment, or whatever you call it. And I think he did come and speak to us. And sometimes, Ward would come in and talk about something he wanted to publish, it seems, a cultural article. And I don't remember anyone specifically, but I'm sure some of the more political articles, international articles, if a writer was not a regular member, they might come in and want to talk about why they were bringing this article up. But usually, with people like, Teresa and John Jacobs, Doyle while he was still there, these guys, they pretty much had a real good understanding of what all the hot political topics were in the nation and the world. So they usually had a good understanding of why somebody was bringing in, say, an article on the Eritrean rebels, or some conflict in Nigeria that I might not have known anything about, but they kind of knew where this was coming from. We always wanted to be as factual as we could. I don't think I never heard anybody show a cynicism about being factual and honest in our reporting. We tried to make sure we didn't try to fabricate anything just because it made us look good. We only wanted the facts, and that showed up no place better than in the local news coverage that John and with Krista's help, John Jacobs and Krista were doing. Now I know they did have to use a lot of anonymous sources, but still, I think they tried to determine that what we were publishing was indeed factual.
And did you do any writing? You mentioned
very little.
With Margaret Mead.
When something needed to be covered, something needed to be written up, and there wasn't, I would do that. But I was not a reporter or a writer. I actually was. I didn't start writing again for another 5 or 6 years. Mm-hmm. I was actually still suffering from writer's block that I had contracted while I was at the University of Tennessee. The literature departments there criticized my writing so much, I found it harder and harder to actually sit down and write anything other than the few term papers I was required to do.
Yeah.
So no, I didn't write. I think the biggest thing I ever worked on was that Margaret Mead interview, and that was mostly transcription.
And these collective meetings, would they last for a good amount of time?
They could easily go on 2.5 to 4 hours. It was, I forget what day of the week it was, but it was brutal.
And in the evening?
Yeah, they were evening. Sometimes they were in the afternoon.
Okay.
It seems like I remember daylight coming into the room. So, but it could have just been, summer evenings.
Mm-hmm.
But it had to be done in time, because we had to get the paper, we had to get everything written. I guess a lot of the copy was already in. It was just a matter of how we were going to prioritize and what was the headline going to be. was there going to be any particularly striking graphic that we needed to, that somebody was bringing in or whatever. And, you know, it seemed, we had all that mundane stuff, and then we would get into whatever the controversy of the day was. And I think we were always looking ahead, what was going to be coming up in the next week and the next 2 weeks. And how many pages, you know, sometimes the number of pages varied. So.
And then following the meeting, this collective meeting, which was weekly, yes?
Yes.
From there, the decisions would be made to actually lay out and produce the paper.
Right.
Would that happen like the next day?
Yeah, well, I mean, we had to type it. There was a team, and we had a woman that, for a large period that I was there, who did the bulk of the typing, but everybody had to do typing. I was talking, again, this weekend I was talking, I think, with Gene, and we talked about how good Roger was at typing.
Roger
Friedman, how fast he was, believe it or not, you know.
And he was still participating?
He would show up and type for 3 hours. I mean, there were other people that were really good too. And
just for the record, when you
why,
said
why
that,
would Roger Friedman, you know, I mean, this highly skilled mathematician and developing computer geek at that point, he was developing his skills as a programmer. Why? I mean, but you know, and he had so many things that he could be doing. He would come in and just type.
Mm-hmm.
And he knew, you know, and it was a great. I mean, he could do in 3 hours what would take me 12. I mean, so it was just great that they would just come in and do that.
Yeah.
So.
And we've mentioned a couple times you saying like that this weekend you in having a conversation with Gene or with Stephanie for the context and record.
Mm-hmm.
This past weekend was the big 50th anniversary celebration
Correct.
of the bird. So we're just coming off of a big reunion and event that brought
Yeah,
lots of
and
people
you know,
back
and it
together.
was so funny for me. The interview I had with you, I guess maybe 6 weeks ago now. It really sparked a lot of questions that I wanted to talk again with the folks about it. Anyway. It was just amazing for me to see those. I mean, I don't even, the pictures that Tom took, I guess, from the first year or the first few months of the three couples that were instrumental in setting up the paper. Just see, I mean, it took me a minute to even recognize them. Except for Gene, I kind of still remember him. He looks, but other people have changed so much. 50 years, I guess it does.
Yeah, no.
It does change us all.
I had a similar, and I didn't know any, I wasn't alive back and were involved, but looking at the pictures and what people look like now, it was striking to have identified that, oh, that was so-and-so. And during your years at the Bird, where were the offices located?
Well, when I initially started, it was at some offices on Juniper Street. It was really, I don't remember the street number. It was just another big old house that since has been torn down. It was maybe a block and a half from 10th Street, but near 9th and Juniper.
And is that the house that had like a little shed in the back?
I think so. I honestly, I mean, they were already tearing things out, moving things in. Okay. And because I came there, I had a little VW flatbed van. It was like a VW van, but it was a flatbed. And they immediately, and Krista immediately, and Doyle too, said, you know, you're going to help us move. And Krista, and I asked her, she didn't remember the fellow. His name is Jim McMeans. And Kelly Jordan was at the celebration last week, and I said, wasn't he an original member of the Little Five Points Pub founders? And he said, yeah, I think so. But anyway, that's another aside. But anyway, there was a fellow who's quite a skilled carpenter. And so when I wasn't doing circulation, and Michael Lewis was still around for a week or 2 or 3, the prior circulation manager, handling most of it, I did help build these offices on what was then Forest Avenue. It's now Ralph McGill, right at the corner of Boulevard. And there was a print shop next door, and maybe a dialysis clinic nearby, but it was sort of on the parking lot side, the Ralph McGill side of Georgia Baptist Hospital. It's now has another name too.
Mm-hmm.
But anyway, that's where we moved.
And who
that
did
was
the carpentry work?
His name was Jim McMeans.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
And it took us, I guess, a better part of a month to get it up. And we used my my van, to carry some of the lumber and sheetrock in. I think Jim had he only had part-time access to a pickup truck. Very interesting. When I had trouble with when my old VW truck broke down, Charlie Cushing, the guy that does the BMW and Jaguar repairs, actually stooped to help me fix up the old van and keep it going for a little bit longer. And he provided I paid for the parts, but or the bird paid for the parts, but he provided his labor free.
Yeah. And so you were on Forest Avenue for the bulk of the time that you were there?
Well, I mean, at some point, I think when we decided to go monthly, we moved to our final location, which was in the second floor offices above Finley Hardware.
In Little Five Points.
In Little Five Points. I think it was called Finley Hardware.
Mm-hmm.
And that was, I'm not sure how long we were there. It was a much smaller space. I think we reduced, we made it into a smaller, almost 8.5 by 11 type magazine format. You've seen. And I think I actually only took about half of the layout tables that we had. We didn't keep nearly as many. I remember Dinah Kohler, have you interviewed her yet?
Mm-hmm.
She came along as a graphic artist there at the end, and she did the final issue, of the wing on the cover.
Yeah.
That was her, saying goodbye to the bird. She somewhat identified with her Native American heritage. I think she arranged for some coverage of those issues while they were there. She's, I think, associated with her husband, John Kohler. And they do some documentaries of their own. I think they're based out of Clayton College right now. Her name was Dinah Rucktashaw at that time. I'm sorry. Dinah Kohler's her current name through John, her husband John. But she was always there at layout too. And like I said, and are you familiar with Dolores French? She was the graphic artist, one of the early people at WRFG. She designed the T-shirt that had the cute little bird, a little bit like a baby bird hatching out of an egg.
Yeah, yeah.
That was her product. Now she was very controversial because she went on to become a prostitute. She was.
And the founder of a group.
Of Coyote.
Coyote, yeah.
Coyote, and was, she was interviewed nationally.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, she was part of and she was also, I don't think she was a member of the collective, and along with Steve, sometimes she got off into some areas where some of they were, for lack of a better term, they were considered to venture into being politically incorrect more often than most.
In what sense?
Well, I think that I hate, to me, it's confusing because you look at the early graphics with semi-nude people in the earlier editions of the paper, but it actually seemed like we'd become a little bit prudish sexually. I mean, of course we supported gay rights and women's rights and everything, but it seemed like Dolores's wanting to kind of glorify or I don't know whether glorify is the proper term, but talk about prostitution as a viable way of making a living was hard for some people to take, as was Steve Seberg, who was kind of from a New York European type of Scandinavian perspective toward the culture. He was a little bit older at the time. He was whopping 43 years old. He seemed he seemed to have a little bit of obsession with women's sexuality, which a lot of people didn't really want him to be writing too much about or covering too much. So I mean, I like I said, I was I was pretty much open-minded at the time, but I didn't, I wasn't going to disrupt everything over some fight, especially if there could be some compromise could be found.
And do you know what Dolores was doing at that time? She was doing graphic arts for you. Was she working as a
Yes,
prostitute?
as a matter of fact, she provided me with some of my supplementary income. She worked for an operation way out on Fulton Industrial Boulevard called the T-Shirt Factory. And Kathy and I would go out there a lot of times and work on the weekends in this T-shirt production. Laying the shirts. It was while it was mechanized, it was still pretty labor intensive. We would have to lay the T-shirts flat on this belt, and make sure the printing machine was working properly. And then when they would come out, we would let them dry, and then after they dried properly, box them up. Mm-hmm. So yes, so that was she, and she was a graphic artist. Mm-hmm. And so she had some, within a couple years though, she had decided to go ahead and be a prostitute. But I never really discussed that part of her life with her very much.
And so you're working some side gigs at the same time. About how many hours a week do you think that you were spending at the Bird?
Well, as long as we stayed on Forest Avenue, I was probably there 30 to 40 hours a week.
Mm-hmm. And were there many other people there at the same?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, it just seemed like whoever it was Doyle at first. And Doyle got a job working, Doyle Neiman. He was our manager, our business manager. He got a job working for In These Times, which was another progressive left-wing kind of I don't know what they were associated with, kind of a quasi-socialist, democratic socialist organization that had a publication, and he went and worked for them. He left us to work, and then Michael Grossman, who was from Queens, I think. He worked at a bookstore, at a shoe store in downtown Atlanta, and he would come in. He did the books, and for a while there, and I think he was a voting member of the collective while he did that.
Mm-hmm.
But anyway, what was?
I was just asking about like how many hours a week you were spending at the office,
yeah.
and
But
were there
it
other
seemed
people?
like John, when I would come in the morning, John was, seems like John was there on the phone talking to his contacts at City Hall. Krista would be in there working away on stuff. Teresa would come in. She was the international news editor, and she was constantly trying to bring in the best articles she could, or talking with Bob Goodman or Steve Weiss they were frequently contributors on those articles from Asia, of Africa, and South America. So yeah, we were there, and of course, my friend Kathy, she would be in there, trying to call and get ads. No, we would go in. I think we would walk in. Yeah, I'd get in there most days at 9. I would either take the bus, from Little Five Points to get down to office, or a lot of times I would just walk if there wasn't a big rush to be, just a 20, 25-minute walk from where I lived.
And can you talk about the relationships among the members of the collective and the extended?
Well, I mean, a lot of the people that had been there for a while, they had all kinds of relationships. A lot of us socialized together. I think I told you that when I first came there, Krista set it up so that Kathy and I went around and had dinner with a half a dozen people, not just people that worked actively in the burg, but people in the community. Like we had dinner with Ted Broduck and Monty, Ralph Green and Mary Britting. Seems like, and of course, I know they also had let's go to see Tom and Stephanie, and actually Tom was not that much of a presence back at that time. Maybe a couple others that I've forgotten. But yeah, I mean, and every weekend I was going to some party somewhere, the Atlanta Lawyers Guild would be doing something, so I would go to parks in Virginia. I would go to parties in Virginia Highlands, Little Five Points, Midtown, and Grant Park.
That usually in somehow were connected
and it was all
to the
kinds
burg.
and so many of these people, at some point or another had been involved with the burg. I remember the first time I met Reaper Bolt, I said, my goodness, what is this biker doing here? And they told me he was part of he was an early burg contributor and a prominent legal aid lawyer and a prominent opponent of the death penalty. Al Horn, who was he was an older attorney that had also been very helpful in those issues. I don't know what the exact connection was, but in '74, Zell Miller, when he was running for lieutenant governor the first time, he actually advertised in the Great Speckled Burg. He had a picture. He was posing. I think, kind of had himself perched up, or one leg perched up on a wooden fence. He was wearing blue jeans and a plaid shirt. He was trying to appeal to the young, hip demographic, and he advertised. He had a couple. Anyway, I remember going to a party in Grant Park where he stood on the steps of some grand flowing staircase and gave a quick little, what do you call it, meet and greet speech. And I was just, wow.
Then, of course,
and I don't know if I told you,
on
but my father had known Zell Miller when my father went to Young Harris College, and while Zell Miller was a high school student back in those days. And if you know much about his story, he talked about talking with all the World War II veterans as he was coming. He didn't mention my father by name, but they and I remember how disappointed my father was in 1960 when he ran for the House of Representatives as a segregationist. And I remember my father saying, I'm sorry to see Zell is choosing that path.
And did he win this election in '74?
Yeah, in '74, I think he was lieutenant governor for what? 16 years, and then he finally got to be governor. I mean, he was a powerhouse.
Yeah.
And he did some, he did from time to time take on very progressive issues. Just never really knew. I knew the women in the state legislature during those years felt that he was helpful to them for some of their issues.
Mm-hmm. At this time, where were you all having the bird printed?
I think it was called the Walton
Walton Press, or
Walton Tribune Press in Monroe, Georgia.
yeah, yeah.
And that was another thing I was asking Steve Weiss. I said, it seemed to me we had to get it to the, I think it was the Trailway station. It might have been Greyhound. There was 2 big buses. And we had to get it there by like 3 o'clock to catch a bus. And they would drop it off at the Tribune by 6 a.m. Otherwise, if we missed that bus, somebody had to drive it. And Steve said, well, it's just, it's nowhere to go to Monroe. And I said, well, at 3 in the morning heading out that way, it's this, after you've been awake since 6 or 7 that morning, it was quite a ride, and usually 2 people would do it.
And were you all still on the same schedule so I guess layout would be?
Honestly, I don't remember what day of the week it was.
But there was the collective meeting one day to decide things, and then
I'm thinking it was probably Monday. It would have to have been Monday.
For the collective
or
meeting?
Tuesday, maybe Tuesday. And then because Wednesday, a lot of, and you know what, it's funny that it seems like a lot of times on layout day, the first person in would be Stephanie, even though she might not be too much involved in figuring out. She would be in there laying out the boards, getting things ready. She loved it. It was just instinctive to her to get that process going. And then all day long, people would be coming in on layout. They'd get typing. Steve and I think talked about how he would come back and edit and retype things if there was any kind of mistake made, or if he felt that it had been misedited.
Mm-hmm.
And I do remember a lot of people, Steve in particular, but there were others.
Steve
They
Weiss.
came by to see, they wanted to make sure that the article was being printed as they intended it. And I don't remember anybody trying to stop a writer from changing something, as long as they were willing to sit at the composer and do it and bring it back. We respected people's whatever it is to write their article as they express it. If we'd accepted it, then they could go right ahead and make sure that it was written the way they intended.
Mm-hmm. And you were always there for layout, working?
Pretty much, almost. I would just come. I enjoyed the social time, to tell you the truth.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of my work was drudgery during the day, and I was new in town still. Even after I'd been there a year and a half, I was still relevant. I loved just talking with people. I loved the camaraderie. I loved seeing Steve Weiss come in, and to see his eyebrows raised if something needed to be changed. It was a lot of fun. I mentioned two guys that helped a lot with layout, Bob Dorland and David Jenkins. Mm-hmm. They were very technical. They were both good friends of Stephanie, and they worked well with her. And it was just fun to see what they could do. Sometimes they would do things graphically. Seems like Bob was a little more freehand, and David could do these geometric shapes. He later went on. I think he got a graphic artist job at the New York. transit, the New York, so what's that called, New York Transit System or whatever.
Mm.
And that's when he left Atlanta. Neil Herring was always hilarious. You know, he was a regular editorial writer for the Gazette when I had come to the Bird. He was good friends with Rick Brown. And it was so funny, you know, but he would bring in his legislative reviews during the winter. And he would just come in with his copy and just slam it down on my desk and say, you know, give this to John or whoever the local news was. And then he would turn around and go back out the door. Wouldn't even say hello. But
Just out of having a curt personality?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, because he had been a long time staffer at the Bird, and then
right.
there was this schism where
right.
Rick and Liza Brown started the Atlanta Gazette, and so Neil went with them and was writing.
Right, and he had a beautiful column that I always read in the Gazette. Ripsaw is what it was called. Interesting name for a fellow whose father was a shop teacher at a high school up in North Georgia.
And so you describe layout as an intense process, but for you it was
very social. Yeah. It was, and I loved.
And probably so for other people too.
Oh, I think so. I think almost everybody loved it. And like I said, the artists would come in then. You know, Dinah would come in at that point sometimes, and go to work and come up with a design, or Dolores.
Mm-hmm.
Or Stephanie, she could do stuff too. So I mean, I'm not even being fair. There were so many people whose names don't come to mind.
Yeah.
But it was just, you know, and just watching the paper come together was a fascinating process. So mainly what I did was just fit things on pages. You know, take the copy, slice it with a little X-Acto knife, and fit things together. Put the graphic in. You know, we had all these folders full of file pictures and graphics. We would get, you know, sometimes we needed to fill a space. And Stephanie would say, Alvin, go find something from the LNS, Liberation News Service. Find some little article that's 4 inches long. So that's what I would go do.
Mm-hmm.
You know?
Mm-hmm.
So that was...
And the Bird was still accepting advertisements.
Oh, yeah.
Classified ads and running a weekly calendar.
We did have a calendar. It's funny, I guess we did have classifieds. I don't really remember much about that. I guess that would be a good one. I can't imagine we wouldn't.
Yeah,
but I don't, sure. You know what, but I am drawing a blank on that. It wasn't something that really impacted me. I mean, there was Og the King and the other guy, Wolf von Stinkenauer. They had a couple. They paid to have their little things, their little publications, their little columns published.
Right.
And again, I was thinking, who was I trying to think of? Boyd Lewis would bring in articles, and he was also a photographer.
Mm-hmm.
And M.S. Mike Bucky. You know, and they both did stints as reporters for WABE radio, I think in the 90s and early 2000s.
And Boyd at the time was working for another paper, was he?
Yeah, I think didn't he work for the Atlanta Daily World?
Yeah, that's what I was thinking.
Yeah. But these characters would come in and they were just fascinating. Bill Cutler, he primarily wrote articles about bicycling and stuff like that, but he was also occasionally, I think he did occasional gay rights articles. And and these guys were just fascinating personalities. Burl Boykin, he would come in and he was always kind of outrageous in whatever he was up to those days. I remember
outrageous in what sense?
Well, he just he was always talking about I don't know, he just had something that he was wanting to make a fuss about, whether it was I just remembered that he was one of the people that Krista set up for Kathy and I to meet when we were new, and he was one of the few people that didn't invite us to his house. He had us meet him at a lesbian bar, which was at the corner of Virginia and Highland at the time. You would never have guessed. Kind of across the street there from George's and whatever that other old Emory Virginia Highland bar is. And so he had us just meet there, and he was always just a colorful character.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway.
And was John Jacobs equally a
Yes.
colorful character?
Yeah.
We've interviewed Burrell, and he talked a little bit about John.
You know, I always, John, you kind of had a tiptoe around John. He was gruff and kind of rough to everybody, and slamming the phone down and shouting. They said he was legally blind, but he took some amazing photographs. And he would be one of the people, you didn't want John to get too upset. You didn't want John to get, so yeah. And I always tiptoed around. I didn't want to say anything that would upset John. I wanted him to, because his writing was so good, it was really, at that point, it was really one of the most outstanding aspects of the paper. Everybody, they were said people at City Hall, would buy out, the box in front of City Hall would be bought out immediately as soon as we dumped it off there. They would be sometimes standing around waiting for us. So, yeah. And like I said, Steve Seberg was a character. Well, he was there. The rest, I'm trying to think. And Dolores, yeah. So there were quite a few characters. And then I mentioned, I also went around asking people if they remembered Gypsy Dell, and nobody else remembers her, but I'm sure she was there. And then there were just the rest of us that were just kind of worker bees.
Mm-hmm. And so when you serviced the boxes, taking out any remaining copies, putting in the current issue,
Mm-hmm.
repairing, but you were also collecting the money that had been deposited.
Yeah, we had a master key and just a little
Yeah.
lock at the end.
And then would you bring that back,
Oh,
and
yeah.
whoever the business manager was,
Everybody,
they would handle
exactly.
the
Doyle,
accounting.
and then later Mike, counted it all. I have no idea. Like I said, toward the end there, it was not that significant a part of our income.
Mm-hmm.
But we felt we wanted people to pay at least till we decided. I think it was free at the very end when we went to monthly.
Mm-hmm.
And then we did, and I think also at that point we were doing more countertop distribution in stores and commercial use.
Mm-hmm.
I know that was definitely more. It was like that when we. But I think didn't we charge again in '84 and '85? Do you remember?
I don't
I
know.
remember because I had a route then. I did a West End route back in those days. And we may have done subscriptions too.
Did you keep the Berg boxes through the very end in '76, or when you went
Yeah,
monthly?
I think so. I forget exactly what happened, but there was a little consumer magazine that was coming out, Common Sense maybe, and they bought all of our boxes. I think that it seems like they contacted Tom, and he brought the proposal.
Mm.
And we said, sure, let's sell them. I think they bought them for $10 or $15 a box,
Mm.
something. And we did sell most of them. But yeah, toward I believe, it was becoming harder and harder. The boxes were were breaking down more and more. They were an eyesore. And I think that more than the fact that people objected to our political content, I think it was more they just thought they were unsightly.
And what did they look like? Were they all a standard color, or did they
Yeah,
have
they were,
like...
well, what I remember is they were blue, and it was just plexiglass. I guess it was four, yeah, it was, what would that be, 5 sides, kind of rectangular. And I'm trying to remember how we held them. I think maybe it was just spring loaded, and you could, so once you put the quarter in, you could, the catch would release, you could lift it up and pull and hopefully you would just pull one paper out.
Right. But they weren't painted with a great speckled bird?
Oh, I think there was, I think it was on the bottom.
And it was just the logo?
It was just the logo or something down there at the bottom. It said maybe there was a banner across it, I don't remember. There could have been a banner, but we wanted people to be able to look in and see the paper.
Yeah.
So it was like that, I guess. Yeah.
And in your...
You don't have any pictures of them?
I'm sure somebody does.
Yeah, so.
But in your repairs, would you, if a box was looking really dilapidated, like just in terms of paint, would you like take it back
I don't
and repaint it?
I don't remember doing that, but it seems like if I'm thinking right, there might have been two issues. But if it was a more rectangular, like a television set box, there could have been room for paint. But the rest of them, they were pretty much almost, wire. They were just little arms, legs that just held up this kind of simple metal frame.
Okay.
So it wasn't a whole lot to them.
Mm-hmm.
There was a few screws, a few bolts, a spring or two, and the plexiglass, and the hinges.
So you mentioned earlier also that you had very strong passions or activism around the environment.
Mm-hmm.
Can you describe?
Well, I guess for some reason my mother was obsessed with conservation, and and then I had been a Boy Scout, and I just loved going out in the woods, and I always didn't like it when we would come across an area that had been cut, or a new, trees have been cut, or roads have been cut through an area that had once been roadless. But I guess the big thing that hit me was Earth Day 1970. And it was so funny, it was right after, or right around the same time as the invasion of Camponia, followed by the shooting at Kent State, in Jackson State, Mississippi. And but I just remember, and it was so funny because the Earth Day speaker, out of town's Earth Day speaker on our campus was, believe it or not, from Kent State. And I remember him, I don't remember much of his speech at all, but I remember him commenting on the irony that here he was from Kent State, but he was here to talk about the environment, not about the war or National Guard brutality in that case. So it just stuck with me for a while. Knoxville, Tennessee, we were in the Smoky Mountains. It's just a real sensitivity and concern for the environment, a lot of it. So I just always had a real strong affinity for the environment, and it just was something that I had one of my own personal interests, and it became even more so than in being involved in politics for a while, though, you know, in politics is very much involved with affecting the environment.
And were you involved with any groups at the time that were?
At that time, I don't think I was involved with anything. I know that after I left the Bird and started having regular jobs, I immediately became subscribed to Audubon Magazine and Sierra Club. I was real sympathetic to even some of the more extreme groups like Earth First and those kind of groups. And like I told you, the first job Doyle got for me was in shortly after, right around the time the Bird closed, was working for the Citizens Coalition on Hunger. And I had, and then I later, after about 1.5 years there, I went to work for the Public Interest Research Group. This was all funded by the CETA program. And
what's the CETA program?
I forget. It was some sort of federal jobs program because there had been a recession there in the mid-'70s.
And
it was administered by the city. Shirley Franklin was the city hall manager for Mayor Jackson of that program at the time.
And she eventually would become mayor.
Mayor herself, yeah.
And is CETA CETA?
Yes.
Yeah.
And so I had 3 very interesting jobs. First, I worked at the Citizens Coalition on Hunger. I basically did food stamp advocacy. With my main concentration is what we help people go through the bureaucratic process of qualifying for food stamps. And that back at that time, I think it was the Department of Agricultural program. It was a big thing. Bob Dole was behind it, and I forget who the Democrat was that helped him and helped set that program up. And so a lot of times, I would help people make sure they really did qualify, and then if they did meet all the qualifications for getting food stamps, then I would back them up if, for some reason, they were rejected food. But it only happened a few times. And then I went on to work. I used in the same building. There was another CETA qualified group, the Public Interest Research Group. And that's where I really first got involved with environmental issues here in Atlanta. That was, I guess, around 1977, after the Bird. And one of the first things we did when I started there was we had the lobbying environmental groups had a lobbying organized day, and I learned how to go to the state legislature and how to page a state representative or a state senator, how to go to committee hearings, how to find a bill, learning the process of how bills are written up, those type of things. And this was organized by a group called the Georgia Environmental Council, and it was kind of a coalition of all these Georgia environmental groups. Of course, the Georgia Conservancy was very prominent. Sierra Club was around to some, back in those days, it was the Alabama-Georgia Sierra Club. There was a Sierra Club for both states in those days. Audubon was present. At that point, they were mainly a very active bird watching group. A lot of the CDC scientists and Emory professors were Audubon members.
And you were involved attending meetings? And,
it was a full-time job, so yeah, I would go to meetings, I would lobby, we were technically funded, the office was funded by student activities fees, believe it or not. Back in those days, a half a dozen Georgia universities and colleges voted to have a little bit of their activities fees go toward this funding this office. And we basically, at that time, I was funded, my salary was paid by the federal government, CETA, but they had this young lawyer straight out of law school, Emory Law School, who was the administrator, and that basically paid for his salary and keeping this little office open in the Presbyterian church, not too far from here.
Central Presbyterian? That's where
yeah,
your offices were?
Yeah, yeah.
For
And
both of your
it's so
CETA
funny.
funding.
I remember I could look out my office, and down in the playground there was a daycare center where I would watch Simon Coffin and Nathan Guerrero play.
Okay.
I knew both of those boys when they were children.
Yeah.
And they would be down there playing in the ground. I would see their mothers, Stephanie and Pam, drop their boys off. But anyway, that's a side. But yeah, so that's how I got it. And a lot of our work was environmental. We opposed a dam being built on the campus of Berry College. I think it was called the Rocky Mountain Pump Storage Facility. We got involved with opposing the coal plants that were being Plant Sure that was being built down near Jackson, Georgia, I guess it is. And of course, we were in the early stages of Plant Vogel. And there was also one plant existing in Baxley, Georgia. So I can't remember the nuclear plant down there. So we just river cleanup and all these rivers, pollution. Those were a lot of the issues. It wasn't strictly environmental. We also did. They rewrote the landlord-tenant law in Georgia, and we did a handbook on how to young people could finance how to finance buying your own home, how to set up your own, how to apply for a mortgage. So we did some of those issues. That's how I got involved with it. At that point in time, there was a group up in New England called the Clamshell Alliance that was opposing the building of a nuclear power plant in Seabrook, New Hampshire. And that's how we got involved with that. The kind of the president of the board of Georgia PERC was a fellow who had been, he had been just the state president of Georgia PERC, and he had graduated.
What is PERC?
Public Interest Research Group.
Okay.
And I think they've still got some sort of version of it around. It was a network of organizations established by Ralph Nader for consumer advocacy. There was also these mailings coming into us from these different little organizations in Alabama, primarily that were opposing the nuclear plants along the Tennessee River. So that's how we got. So we sort of started looking into this nuclear power plant. It seemed to be a whole lot of social action. There was, big demonstrations being held and sit-ins at nuclear power plants. They were using nonviolent civil disobedience as a tactic to try and disrupt the plants because generally the hearings before the Public Service Commission or whatever rulings came down from the Atomic Energy Commission or the Nuclear Regulatory Commission is what it had become, were pretty much very hard to change anything there.
And were you participating in these
Right.
demonstrations?
Well, I remember we drove down to Baxley, Plant Hatch. Tim Johnson, myself, a fellow Dennis Hoffert, who was one of the people that started the Atlanta Bicycle Campaign. There was about 5 of us drove down in Tim's old 442 or Cutlass, I forget what it was, so one of those old Oldsmobiles. We drove all the way down to Baxley. I remember going through Vidalia, and we released, I guess, maybe 500 balloons with little messages, you're downwind of a nuclear power plant. And I remember, but there was maybe 5 of us, and I'm sure there was at least 12 or 15 security guards photographing us at the other end of the parking lot. I've always wanted to contact the Georgia Power Company to see if they got any good pictures.
And was Neil Herring
No,
around any of this at the time?
No. I mean, Neil was the head. I mean, Roger Friedman and an attorney named David Slissel were the principals in a group called the Georgia Power Project.
Mm-hmm.
And they were involved, and Stephanie was involved with a group that one of the early stockholder groups that would go. They bought 1 or 2 shares of Georgia Power stock or Southern Company stock and would go to the annual shareholder meeting. And a lot of her issues were around South African coal. Neil was against rate hikes and coal plants. But he kind of kept an arm's length distance from the anti-nuclear group. I remember one of his associates, Phil Hoffman, who was a speechwriter for Maynard Jackson, he one time referred to us as the nuclear fear crowd. But
had Neil been around the peripheries of the other environmental work that you were doing with?
Well, I have to say, I don't remember seeing him. He must, and I'm not sure, he probably was there. I don't know who I haven't checked with him.
And I don't recall the exact.
But he's always been fascinated with the state legislature. Okay, so when I was with the environmental group in '77, I mean, he'd been dropping off articles on the state legislature in '75 and '76.
At the Bird.
So there's no reason why he wouldn't have been there. But he was pretty much involved in covering the issues that he covered.
Mm-hmm.
And he wasn't going to get entangled in with a bunch of, and I might be being very unfair to him. But at that point, he and I became associates later. But at that point, he had his issues. The technicalities of the rate hikes and opposing the coal plants. He didn't care much for Baxley either, but he wasn't going to go release balloons trying to scare people about being downwind of a nuclear power plant.
He was going to lobby at the Capitol.
Yeah. So that was, show up at a rate hike hearing. Mm-hmm. Before the Public Service Commission. So anyway, but we gradually we formed an organization for Georgians for Clean Energy that later evolved into Georgians Against Nuclear Energy, which they were building a nuclear reprocessing facility.
Before we go there,
yeah.
Can we go back and just finish?
Yeah, I didn't know whether you were trying to transition or not.
I think that I want to make sure to see if there's anything else.
Well, we could
that you wanted to talk about the Bird, but I wanted to ask the last question of, can you just talk about your recollections of the last gasps of the Bird and the decisions to fold the paper?
Well, it was sort of an unspoken topic.
Because you were there till the very, very end.
Yes.
Yeah.
It was sort of like I said, an unspoken elephant at the table from almost the very beginning. How long can we keep this thing going? And but after, and I don't remember, I do not recall exactly I'm sure it was finances that forced us to go from weekly to monthly and move to the offices to the second floor above Finley Hardware. At that point, when it became monthly, the regular meetings were over, and it was just a matter of having a few meetings during the month leading up to production, trying to find a little advertising if we could. I don't remember. Maybe we didn't even bother anymore. I'm sure there were people that wanted to put ads or announcements in the paper. but it was just more of a magazine format, more of a review format than trying to deal with breaking news. I believe a lot of the same people stayed active. Krista, I believe John may have left. John Jacobs may have left at that point. I remember Dinah being very, very prominent with her graphics. So it was a much different atmosphere. I'm sure that Stephanie was still around. And then, of course, we would, once a month, we would have big layout production. It was real painful. You know, by that time, I did have, you know, by that time I was probably working on the Coalition on Hunger. So we all had other, it was no longer, there was no longer any full-time staffing. People wrote the articles and did their graphics, you know, on their own. And then, you know, we would come together, you know, after we had agreed on the content, we would come in and put it together. And I think we were still taking it to Monroe till the end. Mm-hmm. It was real painful. Still at the same time, you know, it was, especially for those of us, like people like me, it was a real sense of, you know what, I bet it was the same for Stephanie and Jean too, you know. A real sense of respect that we kept it as high quality as we possibly could, stayed true to the principles of openness, you know, and letting voices that didn't normally have an outlet, make sure they were heard. And just, like I said, keeping it a quality and in a very graphically beautiful product to the end, you know. You were there, I mean, I felt like as a pallbearer for the bird, that I wanted to put it to rest with dignity, and I think we succeeded in that. I think we didn't just start putting out something on mimeograph again. We went ahead when we couldn't do the kind of paper that we felt was something that we would be proud of and that could impact our community. We just let it go.
And you had, I recall reading in the Bird, in these. There are various moments in the history of the Bird where it's sort of on the cusp of do we continue on, and particularly in these last couple of years, there are pleas in the pages of the Bird of
we had the bird feeder program. That was something that I think Krista came up with, or at least she promoted it if it wasn't her idea from the art. We tried to get people to send $50 a month or whatever if they would.
Yeah, and asking more people to become involved
subscribers and whatever,
and with production and
yeah, I mean,
and there were benefit concerts like you mentioned, and all sorts of efforts to reinvigorate.
Yeah, it does seem there might have been a few nights there on the last few months when there wasn't a lot of people to help with layout. I don't know. It seems like we always got it done. I do remember taking the paper myself on 2 occasions to Monroe. So that meant it went on late. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, we stayed friends with people. I mean, stayed in touch. But I guess we also went off on our different paths as well. Like I said, I went off to the Coalition on Hunger and PERG, and then later, and I also worked as under the same CETA program. I actually worked as a bookkeeper for a year at WRFG.
Oh, really? And that was funded through the federal government or filtered through the city?
Yeah. And that was a lot of fun. And that was during the period when Bernard West, Cliff Kuhn, and Harlan Joy were in the middle of doing their Living Atlanta project.
Yeah.
So that was kind of neat. I mean, I'd known Harlan a little bit. I'd worked with Cliff Kuhn at the Bird, he had been bringing his historical articles in. And they were there all the time, using the recording facilities and editing facilities
At WRFG.
At WRFG. So I would see Cliff and Bernard. Harlan trained me in the bookkeeping. He was so glad. He was so involved with the Living Atlanta project. He was so glad to be able to unload that task. And then Chris Carroll, who was the office manager at the time at WRFG, I think she was just glad she used to have one more staff person. I mean, there wasn't enough work to be a full-time bookkeeper.
But you were working full-time hours?
Yeah, I was working a 40-hour week. Yeah.
And was that in the same
the
building?
It was in the stations, yeah. Oh yeah, I mean, I forget who the first person was. It might have been Yvonne Dooley in his show, or I don't know which show it was. But they would bring me in, and I would read out the bills that had come in that week. And as part of their pledge, getting people to fund the thing, they would say, who's going to pay the Georgia Power bill? Who's going to pay the program printing bill?
And is this
who's going to pay our plumber that fixed our toilets?
Yeah.
And I would be reading out the bills, and so that they used me as a prop.
And is this like 79, 80? Or?
This was 79, 78, 79, 80. I think it was a 12-month stint.
Okay.
Probably 78, 79, because I know it was in 79 that I went and interviewed at Magnolia Co-op Warehouse and got accepted there. And that was a whole other type of gig there. And it was an offshoot of Seven Onda here in Atlanta. But what had happened was that several other big natural food co-ops had formed in other states. There was one in Tallahassee, there was one in Pensacola, there was one in Gainesville. I think there was one in Birmingham, there was one in Mobile, there was a smaller one in Knoxville, there was one in Columbia.
Virginia?
Oh, yeah. Savannah. Well, the trip to Virginia was to pick up the flour.
Okay.
We would go into this, just across the North Carolina, we would go into Virginia, 15 miles into Virginia. There was a young fella about my age, he was probably 30-ish at that time, he ground whole wheat. Now, most of it was not, very little of his products were organic at the time, but it was naturally ground whole wheat. He also had rye flour and buckwheat, different types of flours you could use for baking, etc. So we would drive. At that time we had like a 10-foot, 20-foot flat box truck. It was just a 6-wheeler. It was not a tractor trailer, but we refrigerated it to keep certain foods like our cheeses cool. So anyway, at the time I went there, it was it had been in operation about 9 months. I think they'd started it like in January of 1979.
And had you been really active in Atlanta's Seven Onda Co-op?
I had been a member from the very beginning. I was what they called a charter member. I joined in January of 1975. Prior to that, Seven Onda had been a natural foods store at Emory, kind of near where the falafel place is. Right around there, they had a little bitty natural food store. It was run by the Ananda Marga Society, which is some sort of, I guess, Hindu sect that had a social, whatever you call it, a social purpose type orientation, social outreach. And they had decided to form, I don't know, the two guys, their Hindu names were Dirgadarshini and Vishwakena. They started Seven Onda. It's one of those places in Little Five Points. I've forgotten where the first store was. And you know, you for like $5 you could be a member, and if you worked 1 day a week at the co-op, you got a discount in addition. So I would just go in there, you know, and slice cheese or break down boxes or unload trucks, whatever was happening at that. And I had an appointed hour a week that I would show up. Maybe it was 2 hours. I would show up and work, and I got a discount, a further discount on the co-op. But other than that, I hadn't been involved too much. There were meetings there. I would go to them and all, but I knew the people, but I was not intimately involved in it. I wasn't. Some people just spent a whole lot of time there.
Were you a vegetarian?
Seems like I was.
Mm-hmm. And then you're finishing up the Bird and then working at these other
Gigs,
Yeah.
the seat of gigs, yeah.
Uh-huh.
And I wound up working for the warehouse about 7 years.
And so you started there in '79.
Yeah, and I went in
I should
just
ask, do you need to take a break?
Let's
at
take a
all?
break. This is a good point.
Yeah. Okay, so we're coming back from a little break. We had some refreshments, and are picking back up. So as we were talking over the break, if you would talk a bit about your experience with GAIN, and that's Georgians Against
Nuclear energy.
Yes.
Well, I was really proud to be one of the people that organized that organization, starting probably in 1977. It started out that primarily Tim and I were getting all this correspondence from the budding anti-nuclear movement, both in the Southeast and in along the Northeast coast. And we decided to show some, like I mentioned, some of the early, so I had some early little educational events, and we did a balloon release down at Plant Baxley in South Georgia. As time went on, we gathered a few more people that were interested in helping us. It kind of grew alongside of what's now the South Face Institute. It was called, there was a group that was advocating solar energy at that time called the Solar Coalition. And there was a Sunday, I guess it was either in May or probably in May of 1977, 78, around that time. But we were kind of the other side of that, the anti-nuclear advocates. We started holding little meetings at the library in Inman Park with various topics once a month. And maybe there was 10 or 12 people the first meeting, and we were having 30 or 40 people within a couple months. It was a coalition of two groups. There was the people that were directly opposed to nuclear energy, and then there was the people that were primarily concerned with nuclear weapons. They were kind of what I think they called the moratorium group. This was concomitant with the election of Ronald Reagan and the advent of Star Wars and just a whole lot of nuclear brinksmanship that occurred early in the Reagan administration. So there was a whole lot of things coming together here. It was so broad, so diverse. It's even hard for me sitting here in front of the camera trying to try to put some coherency to it, but evidently it captured the concern of a lot of people in Georgia and Atlanta, because our organization within less than a year had gone from having 12 people to close to 100 people showing up at the library to see our little films and our speakers. Mike Grossman, who had been the bookkeeper or been the office manager in the last days of the Great Speckled Bird, was also involved in this organization with me, as was Julia Cade, who'd been our culture writer, and she had covered the southeast music scene. She came in and helped us do some of our early publicity for legislative concerns and for some of the big demonstrations that were being held in different areas. Mike resigned to move up north to Minnesota. I took over as the coordinator at that time. I served in that capacity for a little while, and the next thing I gave up my position as coordinator so I could work full-time at Magnolia Warehouse, which I'm going to go on to next. At that point, Danny Feig and Carol Stangler took over the organization as co-coordinators, and it just took off. We were having meetings once a month at various locations in Inman Park and Candler Park with typical meetings of over 100 people. So we intervened at the Public Service Commission. We lobbied at the state legislature. We held demonstrations downtown. I believe one of our biggest anti-nuclear marches after the 3 Mile Island incident, I believe Julian Bond was our keynote speaker. So it was a very big organization, a lot of participation, not real focused, but it had a real impact, and it's still alive today, I believe, under the name of Nuclear Watch South. So.
And you remained active.
I stayed active in that organization. I did the news. We had a little newsletter, and I did that for a couple of years. It was nothing like the Great Speckled Bird, but I did. It was fun for me to put together a little 4-page newsletter. Mm-hmm. Another outgrowth of that was the Campaign for Prosperous Georgia, which was I guess it had 3 funded staff people that was much more involved with research and advocacy, education. They hired a lobbyist, Neil Herring, to lobby for them, and we hired attorneys and expert witnesses to go before the Public Service Commission on some of the rate hikes that occurred in the future during that period. Anyway, it's bad. At times we did civil disobedience action. We were part of the Barnwell Alliance, and once again, we worked on a consensus basis. It was set up with little groups of 8 to 10 people that would go in and be responsible for each other. We usually had 1 or 2 support people that did not get arrested. And they provided things like, keeping care of other people's business, packing up their suitcases and stuff if they were being held in jail. But we sat in on 2 different occasions in 79 and 80 at the Barnwell Nuclear Processing Facility near Aiken, South Carolina. And that was one of the organizations we got involved with. There were a couple marches on Washington. We went to conferences in Kansas and Louisiana, Cincinnati, and it was just a huge national movement, and we were a part of it.
Were you arrested at any time?
I was arrested at the first Barnwell demonstration. Mm-hmm. It was almost like fake news. They just came and told me I was arrested. I went in there. The jail cell, I don't believe they ever shut the door on us. They just worked us through. They had a prearranged, I think, where we could get bail bond for $15, and I'm not even sure. I never saw it on my FBI record when I got that a few years later, so I'm not even sure it was ever recorded on any basis. The second demonstration, the people were held for about a day or 2, and I did what they called support on that one, and it was a little bit more serious for those folks. I guess they didn't want us to come back a 3rd time, and to my knowledge, we didn't. But like I said, I had been really fascinated with the anti-nuclear movement, but I also needed to make a living, and I had an opportunity to go work at another co-op, and that was the Magnolia Co-op Warehouse. It had started off as an outshoot of Savananda, it was organized and managed by a group of, I think of about 7 or 8 co-ops in 7 southeastern states, and they basically warehoused and distributed bulk items for these natural food co-ops. The biggest and largest was, well, I don't know, it was Seven Onda in Atlanta. But there was also co-ops in Savannah, there were Athens, Birmingham, in Mobile, Alabama, and some of the little areas there along the coast. There were little buying clubs, which are groups of people that come together often through their churches, sometimes through their schools, or just some other informal neighborhood organization.
Mm-hmm.
They used to buy foods in bulk and distribute it themselves amongst themselves. We would just sell them. We would stop off at their school or their church and dump off the stuff. We had 3 or 4 routes. I guess it was 3 routes. We had the coastal route that went down to Pensacola, went as far south as Gainesville, Tallahassee, and back up through Savannah, Statesboro. There was the mountain route, which went through Knoxville and Asheville. Went all the way to Winston-Salem. That was the part of the route that we took a little jog up into Virginia to pick up our flour. And what was there was another one. I may have been mixing the coastal and the Gulf route up, which I guess was the one that went down to Alabama.
And how often would you all make runs?
Well, I think we tried to do the runs on a 2 or 3 week rotating. It may have been a 2 week rotating basis.
And is this organization affiliated at all? Last week I spoke with Don Spiker, and when he left the Bird in 71, 72, he worked for a group that was based out of Atlanta, Southern, forgetting what it's called, but and it still exists, but they were a food co-op that worked directly with food producers, like farmers, particularly like black farmers in Alabama.
Oh, the Southern Federation of Co-ops, I
Yes.
believe as well. No.
Okay.
We were aware, we were very much aware, they were much more political. We were much more into, we were definitely an outgrowth to a large extent of the hippie movement, natural foods, peace, love, and rock and roll type crowd. But I know exactly what you're talking about, and I was really impressed with the work they did. And we were all co-ops.
Mm-hmm.
Now this was an interesting organization too, because it was the federation of each of the founding co-ops. Like I said, there was about 7 or 8. They had a board member. They put a board member on the board, and it was the overall governing group that would probably meet maybe 4 times a year. We also had a conference every year, and then but the staff of the co-op itself was run as a collective. And we also worked on a consensus basis, which made, for some very long staff meetings. But it was again a very, it was really amazing, because even though we did tend to specialize, as a food buyer, the shipper, I started out as a driver and then went into the warehouse and became a warehouser, because really wasn't that good a driver.
In what sense weren't you good? That you weren't fast? Or
Well,
that
I didn't hold up very long for driving. Back in those days, it's bad as it is today. Drivers were much more loosely regulated, and you could drive for 14 hours. And it just wasn't. I got glasses, wasn't that good. But I do remember I was always extremely careful. I remember Wayne, who taught me to drive this 20-foot box truck 6-wheeler. to not trust your mirrors, always look. Because he said one time, in my very first training trip, I just started to move. I was passing, thought I'd cleared the cars, and I was just going to move back in. And he said, look, he was sitting on the passenger side, and I looked, and there was and it wasn't in my mirror, they were in my blind spot, but there was a family in a station wagon. And if I had pulled over there, if he hadn't stopped me, I probably would have wiped them all out. Mm-hmm. And so I just learned that. And the other thing I remember, whenever I was parking or backing up, I was never too proud to get out of the truck and go look. And once I looked at the place, it was fun. After a few months of driving, I thought if I had 6 inches, I could back that truck into a spout. All I needed was 6 inches, and I could drive it that precisely. But it wore on me, and I enjoyed the process of just bringing in the food, stacking it, going down the list, preparing orders, stacking everything very nicely on a pallet, and getting it ready to go out for the next truck run.
And where were you? So the co-op was identifying suppliers, buying from them, and then distributing?
Here's what, yeah. Okay, yeah, well, the like Seven Onda, they would want to get whole wheat spaghetti from Louisville, processed in Louisville or St. Louis. And to get it at the optimum price, you would need to buy 5 of these little 10-pound boxes. But Seven Onda only needed 1 every 2 weeks. So what we were able to do was all these co-ops together would come in, and the warehouse that I worked for would buy the food and would buy quantities that we could have them all shipped directly to us in trucks. It was still a lot cheaper, and then we would redistribute it to all these different various regional city co-ops. So that it was just the economy of scale. And like I said, initially it was just for the actual storefronts themselves, but then we got more and more involved with shipping to the buying clubs, and then a lot of the health food stores would buy from us as well. So we had I guess $6 million business at one point. That was about as big as our staff got up to about 14. Part of our downfall was that we did get involved with, again, bringing in non-collective members, just hiring people that very much felt like second-class citizens, and it didn't. In the end, but in the end, Tree of Life was a much bigger distributor, was able to outperform us and cut us in price. And then and we didn't realize it, but this new little operation that was developing, I guess where was it, in Texas or wherever they're from, Whole Foods, was going to blow us out of the water anyway. So it was probably just as well. But we lasted from, I guess it was early 1979 to when we closed in 1987.
And where was it?
It was located on Memorial Drive. The first warehouse was we were just downstairs from a New Age bookshop, which distributors, I don't know what became of them. We were also...
on what part of Memorial?
It was very close to Moreland Avenue.
Okay.
There was just a warehouse there. It was really great. We could just... trucks could just come in off of Interstate 20, and we could get on Interstate 20 to go on our various routes. We later moved to the space. We outgrew our space there. And the last 4 years, we were on White Avenue in the West End, very near the West End community. It was during that period in '84, while the warehouse was there, that we had the effort to start the try to revive the bird. Mm-hmm. And I was, I remember, I think, well, at that time I was actually, I think that's when I was living around the corner from Neil Herring, and he mentioned to me that Tom and Stephanie were going to restart the Bird. I remember there was a great big meeting in the Coffin's house, and it was so fun. All these old faces, Steve and Bob, and I don't know how many others, and other people I knew from the New American movement and various, whatever that organization was that Jane Fonda and her husband Tom Hayden had at the end. Was it the New American movement? Or anyway, all those people that were in that party were there. And we did agree to go ahead and try and have, I guess, a monthly issue again. Mm-hmm. We hired a staff person, and the offices were located down there. I guess they were here on Cortland Avenue or Piedmont. I forget, one of those streets. We found some little, I guess it was a doctor's office. It was a fairly modern building. Mm-hmm. And we started publishing again.
And you had a staff person.
Yeah. What's his name? His father was a prominent African American artist who's got some paintings that are on the permanent exhibit at the High. My ability to pull out names has suddenly left me. But anyway, so yeah. Yeah, it was a great effort. I mean, I was so excited to think we might get it going again. This was, again, at the height of the Reagan years. It was a very scary time in '84. It was before, the second part of his administration, he kind of toned down the rhetoric a little bit, and we had to, glasnost, and things were better. But the first 4 years were pretty scary. And a lot of us, and of course, and all that fear helped feed the anti-nuclear movement. And I forget, with that one, I guess I just helped with layout and whatever I could do at the time. Just trying to do running around things. I did distribute papers again. I was working on the West End, so I did distribute a lot of the papers that we put out in those days. At the Black College complex and in the West End business community.
And was it largely just countertop sales again?
Yes, as I remember, that's the way it was. We had Neil Herring. He's also a carpenter. He developed these very attractive little wooden stands that you could just sit on top of your counter, and it would display the papers, upright. It was like a book size, mm-hmm. And it had, like I said, it was laminated and had the Great Speckled Bird logo across the bottom of the stand. I should have brought it. I have one at home.
And how many people do you think were sort of in the...
it was a very fluid group. We did have a handful of people. I think Teresa was one of the managers. It's funny. I remember it was a lot of fun. Steve became involved, Roger Friedman became involved, and Neil they were all involved. And I hadn't, really worked with them on quite that collegial a basis back during the first rendition. They had already gone on to their, semi-involved status at that point. Of course, Stephanie and Tom was back, mm-hmm. in a much bigger role. Plus, there was a whole lot of new people with a lot of great ideas, a lot of energy, a lot of creativity. I believe Diana Rucktashaw, now she was Dinah Kohler. She was in doing some of our artwork, as was, I think, Amy Landisberg and others. So it really didn't click financially. Again, we failed to be able to create revenue or to sell enough advertising.
Because that one, I think some other folks have told me that was largely self-funded by
Yeah.
the folks involved, just putting money out of their pocket to keep it going.
At that time, I was still in my co-op job. I doubt I gave a whole lot of money. I probably, whatever I could afford, $50 a month I might have given, but that wasn't part of me. But yeah, you're right, that it was just funded by some of the bird people that had done pretty well in the last 10 years since they had left it themselves.
But even so, it lasted roughly 2 years.
Well, I think it was really only about 8 or 10 issues.
Yeah.
It crossed 2 years.
Yeah.
But it was a great effort. I'll never forget, we did the first issue was during the time of, I guess it's the Dogwood Arts Festival in Piedmont Park. It may have been still called the Piedmont Arts Festival, which it wasn't for a long time. And I'll never forget, we showed up with it, and a lot of the people that were going to the park were just stunned and amused. I'll never forget, Zachary and Simon, the Coffin's sons, were young teenagers. Simon might have been 10 or 12, and Zachary maybe 14, 15. And I remember Stephanie saying that Simon was just totally surprised by some of the hostility that he met. He said that people said, "Oh, you're part of that communist organization, that communist rag." And I said, "Well, what was Simon's reaction?" And Stephanie said, "Well, he said, yeah, I guess I am a communist." So he was, and he just sort of, which I guess was pretty typical of the way the kids of political activists sort of have to deal with things. So anyway, it was a great effort. I was heartbroken again when we had to give up, but it was a great experience and gave me I guess hope, I could say. So that was, is at the co-op warehouse. Again, we weren't real smart about money. There were a lot of decisions that were made that didn't allow us to grow. Sometimes maybe we were a little too concerned with process instead of product. And we did hire a business manager who apparently embezzled a lot of money and made loans to her friends and got us in trouble. And we actually just eventually went bankrupt. And that was a really painful lesson to me because I really enjoyed being a business person on a small scale, being somewhat entrepreneurial. And then looking back on the experiences with the bird, how we just weren't able to generate revenue, I decided that I really needed to learn how business works. And at the encouragement of my wife, who I had actually met her, she was the board member from the Pensacola Co-op.
Oh.
And I was one year I was in charge of organizing one of the conferences, and they all came to Atlanta, and she came to Atlanta, drove up alone, and I helped her get to where the actual conference location was in Cullowhee, North Carolina. We drove up to there again and back, and our romance started. Anyway.
And what year around was that?
This would have been 1983.
Okay.
And and we were eventually married in 86. But as the bird started falling, as the Magnolia Warehouse started failing, I was trying to make, well, what am I going to do next? So I started going to accounting school here at Georgia State University, because I said next time I get into a business enterprise, I'm going to know what's going on. I'm going to be able to understand the financial statements, and I want to be able to see early signs that there's something going wrong with this enterprise on a financial basis. So I did that, and it was an amazing experience to go back to college after 15 years. Everybody will tell you that. I wasn't going to graduate school. I was going back to undergraduate school again to study business administration and accounting.
And did you go straight through? You were a full-time student?
I actually started the last 6 months I was working at Magnolia, going to evening classes.
Mm-hmm.
But then once we went out of business, I had saved up some money. My wife had a decent job, and I said I'd really just like to live off my money, pay off my savings. I'll pay the tuition. If you'll provide the food for 2 years, I'll make it up to you. So we did that. I went to school full time. I guess it was about just under. I guess it was 4 semesters.
And I guess the university took some of your credits.
Absolutely. Yeah, I pretty much came in as a junior.
Mm-hmm.
I did have to take some elective courses. I had a few business administration. I had to take economics, finance, management, marketing course, various marketing courses. But I primarily concentrated on accounting. Was able to get through. It was a very. I was really shocked at how the atmosphere at public universities had changed. It was much more casual. The students were a lot more demanding of the professors. Like I remember people trying to convince the professors to not go through the whole textbook, or asking for the professors to give them a list of questions that would be on the test, or begging professors to grade the tests on a curve. These were the kind of things that back in the late 60s and early 70s you would never think of asking. I mean, it would have been considered so disrespectful or presumptuous for the students to try and bargain with the faculty about how the course was run. But anyway, still, it was a great experience. I enjoyed learning about the world of business from the business perspective. It was very interesting because in the accounting department, there had been a few of the big scandals had recently gone through the savings and loan crisis and the housing. One of the mortgage loan, the savings and loan was the primary. And the accounting industry in that one, just as they were at Enron, was up to their gills in enabling some of the fraud that took place. And there was a real concern of trying to introduce ethics and good governance into the accounting and the whole business profession as a whole. So I got to see sort of the beginning of that, which we still see the business community trying to deal with today, trying to get people in business to realize that it's not just about making money, it is about serving the larger society and behaving ethically. That these things are critical, and as you can tell from the days, whatever's going on in the news today, it still is a big concern.
Mm-hmm.
I always felt a little bit funny, of course, as a person who still considered himself a socialist, at least with a small s, in some sense, and here in business school. But still, there is a logic to it, and it is the society that we're working in. I feel like I need to be able to function in this world. But I was a little bit concerned about going into trying to become some enabler for some cutthroat, even if it's just a small business, let alone a big corporation. After I graduated, I worked for about 8 or 10 months with a small accounting firm. And it was real funny. They hired me for this great big audit they had at the Housing and Urban Development in DC, and then they kept me around to do taxes. But shortly after April 15th, they suddenly had a loss of need for my services. I then briefly worked as a temporary at the trust control department of what was then called the CNS Bank. And I was just getting a little discouraged. At 40 years old, I found a lot of businesses weren't that eager to take me on as a beginning accountant in their department. But I did apply with state government, and I got interviews with 3 different state departments in their accounting. I was real lucky in that I got, I got almost a perfect. I think I only missed 2 points, 2 questions on the entire test. Competition was pretty stiff. But with my score, I was at
This is a test.
This was for
administered
state
by the state.
Yeah, state merit system. I'm sorry, I'm being a little vague. And then, but third interview. So I went with what was it? DOT, the state. I think it was actually the state merit office. I also interviewed with the Department of Transportation and didn't get hired at either one of those places. But then I interviewed with the state insurance department, and they were looking to hire just 3 new state examiners as an experiment. They primarily just used contractors. And so I took that job, and it was a whole new world. And I was, statutory accounting, compliance accounting is totally different from the GAAP that I had been taught primarily while I was in college, and it had a whole, it was all run by the insurance departments. They had their own societies with their own designations, certified insurance examiners and such not. And then, of course, the insurance profession is highly reliant on the work of actuaries. They're sort of the gods that come in and say what will or what will not work. How much do we have to charge? How much can we afford to lose? So anyway, it was a fascinating area. It made me feel a little bit better about what I was doing, because we were, at least in theory, in the insurance department trying to protect policyholders and the public at large by keeping the company solvent and trying to ensure that their practices are fair and legal. So it's been a good profession for me. I've done it now about 28 years.
Did you stay with that
office?
I
I worked at the state office for about 2 years, and they had decided that having on-staff examiners, or which was their term for auditor, was not what they wanted to go. That they primarily used accounting firms and other individuals and firms that specialize strictly in insurance auditing. They wanted me to. He actually added the examiner. Well, the chief examiner is what the position was called. He actually asked me to go find a firm to work with because he didn't want to have me on staff. I said, well, I had looked at the state merit system, or I saw that there was a whole chain of positions that I could probably move up to whatever it was, supervising examiner, which had a pretty good salary and a lot of responsibility. He said, I'll never promote you beyond junior auditor.
Do you know what that was about?
Well, I think he said, well, he had office staff and analysts, and he said, I need to keep all the money that's budgeted to me through the state office, I want to keep it for my in-house staff. I'm not interested in promoting you. I want you to go out and and be a contractor. So I mean, it kind of so they were. I mean, I think it would be better for a lot of state agencies, if they did a lot of their own regulatory work in, with state people, but this whole business of instead of doing that go out and hire contractors and accounting firms to do the work, to me, could be a lot more costly.
Mm.
But that's the road that we've taken over the last 30 or 40 years, so-called downsizing government.
Mm-hmm.
You don't really decrease the cost, you just take it off the books
Mm-hmm.
of that department. So anyway, that's what I've done. Since then I've worked initially just as on my own as an independent contractor, and since then I've worked with 4 different firms. Just started with my 5th firm this week on Monday, a firm based out of Indianapolis.
And it's still in the insurance industry.
Right, we audit. We do these 5 years statutory audits of insurance companies. I can't tell you exactly what I'm doing because it's sort of confidential.
Yeah.
Confidentiality. I don't want to discuss what firm what insurance company I'm currently.
Right.
You know.
And also in these years, you became a parent, correct?
I did. Yeah. The woman I married, Kathleen Maloney, in '86. She was an information systems scientist. She worked one of the it's very interesting. One of the first people that helped her get a job in Atlanta, working for a contractor that worked for the Centers for Disease Control, was Roger Friedman, who I worked with at the Bird. Also, another fellow that helped her was Bob Kane, who also was around during the Bird days, but was also very active in Georgians Against Nuclear Energy. He actually helped her get her first job with a small software firm. Now she works we're divorced now, she works at CDC. But we had a son in 1992. He's 25 now. And he's a doctoral candidate at the University of Minnesota in statistics. So, I was a very old parent at 43 when he was born, but I always said, even though it was a little bit disappointing when he got to be a teenager, and I really couldn't keep up with him as I was well into my 50s, but I never, as an older parent, I would tell people I never had any regrets that I was giving up anything for my child.
Mm.
At 43, I'd pretty much gotten it all out of my system. I'd done everything I wanted to do, and I didn't miss not getting to go to a party or a concert or having to give up going, running in the Peachtree Road race because I couldn't get child care or something. So I don't know. I mean, it had that part of it. I was totally comfortable given whatever it took to be a 100% parent.
Mm-hmm.
So anyway, I don't know. I guess I'll let you, if you want to ask some more questions about.
Yeah, just a couple more. We just have come off of the 50th anniversary celebration this weekend. How do you reflect back on that moment in time, the Bird years, the late 60s, early 70s, and just feel about that moment in history in your life?
Well, we had some keynote speakers, and I thought they really lended some perspective. A lot of people felt maybe it wasn't perfect, or that maybe the 2 members of the Bird group that spoke could have talked a little longer. But we really were part of out of a very important point in history. And I really liked the phrasing that Nan Orrick used, and she was one of the original 6 people that put the idea for the bird together. There was a lot more than 6 people involved in the first issue, but that we're part of a stream of history of people that have fought for justice. And taken in that perspective, to me, it really means a lot that the bird was there, and that I was a part of that, and that I was part of an effort with so many truly outstanding people, so many talented people, and people that at times paid a heavy price, like
Tim Hayes.
Tim Hayes' talk about, his beginnings in the Black liberation movement, his struggles in SNCC and with the Black Panther Party here in Atlanta, about going to the Mideast and trying to organize with Black liberation groups there, and arrestment and harassment and torture that he suffered, all that. I realized that I was part of and supported people that were doing very dangerous and important work. I felt like in a lot of ways my own personal story, doesn't really stand out in the way somebody like Nan Orrick's or Jean Guerrero's did, as far as making a real imprint on society, or really, but at the same time, I stood with these people, and we all fought for justice together. So from that perspective, it felt real important. We were at, it was a real, with as we all have pointed out, as all acknowledged, and as Tim Hayes really emphasized, in the South, the struggle for racial equality kind of overshadows all the other movements, are so intertwined with it. So I'm really glad that I was on the right side of that history. But as far as opposing war, supporting poor people, supporting the right of workers to have a decent wage and a decent working environment, to be there at the very beginning of the gay liberation movement, and to have been an early supporter of that, despite maybe what my initial instincts were, just at my own realization that was another important issue and movement that needed to be understood. So I'm really grateful. I'm really grateful for my exposure to all the people with the bird, and I'm just humbled by the fact that I was able to be a part of it.
Mm-hmm.
So as a lot of us have already passed on that worked on the bird, and I'm sure as every year there'll be more and more of us. I think we have a good place in history.
Do you keep up with many of your former?
Actually, I'm Facebook friends with several people. I like a lot of people. I touch base with the Coffins, and then they always know what so many other people are doing. Our group, Bob Goodman keeps in touch with people too a lot, and we have the potluck reunions, and I've gone to about 5 or 6 years. As a matter of fact, I mentioned Tom and Stephanie. I actually ran into them about 5 years ago at an event that's called Sierra Club and Beer. They have like every other month. They'll have a gathering at some room in a local bar restaurant, And it was on, I think it was on bicycles. It was a program on the Atlanta's bicycle plan going forward in the future. And of course, Tom and Stephanie are very much into cycling. So and they were there, and they remember, they saw me. I hadn't seen them probably in several years, and they asked me to come sit with them, and they said, we're having, and I started asking them about the bird, and they say, Bob Goodman's having these potlucks every year now. You should come. So that was maybe 5 years ago.
Okay.
So I've gone every year since then.
Mm-hmm.
I did go to the 40th reunion, and it's funny. For the 30th reunion, that occurred while I was in accounting school. I didn't go to the 30th reunion because I was studying for midterms or something, but I did keep the books for that group. And I remember I was calling Gene Guerrero, who organized the 30th reunion. That was at the Atlanta Waterworks. Has anybody brought that one up?
No.
It was a much smaller event.
And that was the 30th in like 98?
Yeah.
Okay.
No, 88.
Must have been the 20th in 88.
Oh, okay. I guess I missed the decade there. Yeah. So that was a 20. At that point, 20 years seemed like such a long time. And now at 50, that seems like nothing. So that would have been 88. Yeah. And so that was at the Atlanta Waterworks, and I remember being real proud to be able to apply my counting skills to help the bird. So so I stay in touch with a lot, and Neil is the lobbyist for the Sierra Club, which I'm fairly active in. So I see him or run into him through that organization from time to time. I didn't mention it, but for when I got married, my wife and I actually rented his half of his condo from him, of his house in Midtown from him. And Roger Friedman rented the front half, we rented the back. The only he gave us a bargain, like $200 a month. The only thing is every year from January to March,
he bunked with you?
He bunked in our guest room, so we couldn't have have guests during that period.
Mm-hmm.
So that was part of that experience.
Well, my last question is, what are some of the things in the world right now that occupy your attention, concern, that you feel passionate about?
Wow. The same stuff, the same stuff that brought my attention then. As you get older, you realize you've only got a certain amount of energy and time left. But again, like I said earlier, I'm really, I want to continue to fight for social justice in whatever forms I can. I'm very concerned about the way we're treating immigrants, especially our Latin American guests in this country. I'm worried about I'm concerned about our role in the world, and how we're not helping promote democracy and justice. We seem to be just enabling tyrants around the world. I don't really know. I mean, the whole thing with Trump, everybody, I think that's 5 degrees right of moderate all the way to the left, we're just totally aghast at what he's brought to our national politics. But things were pretty bad at other times. Things were never really good. I'm involved with 2 environmental projects that I'm very passionate about. Through the Sierra Club, I'm working on a committee that's trying to keep the members of the Coca-Cola family and some of the other wealthy people that have retained property on the land from turning 80 acre plot very close to Sea Camp and the visitor center on Cumberland Island into a subdivision.
On Cumberland Island.
Right, which, it was originally, as you know, the island was originally set up to be a wild island, and that was mostly under wilderness designation, which means there's not even roads, but they, local area congressmen have actually pushed back part of that about 15 years ago and allowed tourist buses to run up and down the road, and taken away some of the wilderness designation. And now these same families whose parents and grandparents in the late 60s and early 70s, around the time the Bird was being published, had agreed to not develop their land. And the original plan, though I guess it wasn't signed into a hard contract, was that the land would be, after these people passed away, and I think almost all of them actually have, this land would be sold at a fair market price to the Park Service, so they could convert all of it into wilderness. But now they've decided that that's really not appropriate for them now. They want to be able to make a little money and sell lots to their family members. So I mean, what they're faced with, if you've ever been to Cumberland Island, you know that you come in, you get off a boat, and you cross this main road that I was just describing that's had its wilderness designation removed about 15 years ago. And you go to the Sea Camp, which is a big camp. When I first went there in the late 70s, it was just a really rough place where only the most hardened campers would go, because there was no warm water or anything. Very primitive camping. You had to bring all your food with you. No electricity or et cetera. Now they do have some basic lights and warm water, showers. But anyway, on the other side of that Sea Camp is is the area that they want to develop. So I mean, literally within eye and earshot of Sea Camp, and I guess they'll be sharing beach access. They want to build something like 10 or 20 homes. So for years there'll be the bulldozers and other construction equipment, the sound of hammers, and we're hoping we can get the Park Service to forbid it or even condemn the land. Mm-hmm. So you'll be hearing more about that, if they go forward with this plan. And the other thing that I'm involved with, which a lot of people with the Bird are, including both of the coffins, is trying to save the Metro Atlanta area trees. I'm with a group here in my hometown of Decatur, which is directly adjacent to Atlanta. And we're just what our group's just trying to do is strengthen the tree ordinance, so that it's much harder to cut down the large, significant trees, the 200-year-old trees. The way a lot of the ordinances are written now, you can cut down anything you want as long as you replace it with a equivalent amount of canopy cover. But if they're brand new trees, and if they're not native or high value, what we call high value trees, they really don't even come close to replacing the environmental value of the trees that are being cut down. So those are the two areas that I can most work on. But I also spend time locally at Hope Hill Elementary School. I work in the math class, helping to teach these kids that live in the Auburn Avenue area. Mm-hmm. A lot of these kids don't have parents, or at least only have one parent. So I teach in their math class, and I also tutor a second grade class once a week. Just take a couple kids and work with them on their basic math and reading skills, so that they can pass the proficiency test to go on to the next level.
Right.
I feel like that's at least, I've taken so much from this society, from the best of this society has to offer. I've got at least a decent education. The least I can do is try and help some of the future generation to have a shot at participating in the society, in which you can if you don't have an education. That's those are the areas that I'm most concerned about right now.
Worthy use of your time.
I hope so.
Well, we have covered a lot of ground and exhausted most of my questions and curiosities. But if there's anything that you would like to add, I invite you to. But if you think of anything in subsequent days, weeks, we can always set this back up where we can continue on. But if there's anything that you want to get on tape right now.
No, I just want to say that the only other thing I want to say is the department is the person that was instrumental in setting up this department. I think you described him as a mentor. Cliff Kuhn was a participant in the bird and a writer on Atlanta history and the Great Speckled Bird, as well as WRFG radio. I just want to say how much I admire his insight in setting up this type of program where we realize that it's important to talk to people that were part of or contributed in some way to significant events or institutions in history, that this is being recorded while people are still here to talk to them. So I just want to tip my hat to Cliff.
Yeah, cheers to Cliff. An irreplaceable and irrepressible.
a very important part of that stream for justice in history.
Yeah, and did so much for Atlanta in his research, his teaching, advocacy, and just congeniality. Yeah.
I hope I didn't mention it in the first interview, but also last year at the 49th anniversary potluck, it happened to be the 50th anniversary of Tom and Stephanie's wedding, and it was very interesting, heartwarming just to see the group gather and toast that couple. They were certainly, a lot of people called them the founders, even before the other four people that Nan talked about are even more prominent. And certainly, over the years, they're the two people that almost everyone that had any significant involvement with the bird always remembers and looks to. And like I told you, if I want to know about, whenever I go in to know about somebody that used to be involved with the bird, usually Tom or Stephanie can tell me something. So I also just want to say how important those two individuals were in not only supporting the bird while it was around, but keeping the memory and the significance to the Atlanta community and American history alive.
Yeah,
and
I agree.
So those are my three tributes.
Yes. Well, again, thank you for all the time several weeks ago and again today, and for sharing these stories.
Glad to be a part of it.